The double doors of the Redemption Creek Bank swung open with a bang that was too loud for a Tuesday morning, a sound that cut through the lazy drone of flies and the murmur of polite transactions. John Marshall didn't look up at first. His attention was fixed on the small canvas pouch in his hands, its contents the meager earnings from a month of breaking his back on a patch of land that gave up nothing, willingly feeling impossibly light. He was a man who had learned to keep his head down, to find a strange comfort in the anonymity of dust and sweat. But the silence that followed the bang was wrong. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm or a gunshot. He raised his eyes slowly. 3 men stood framed in the doorway, their long dusters failing to conceal the rifles they held with practiced ease. Their faces were obscured by grimy bandanas, but their intent was as clear as the punishing sun outside. The bank's loan teller, a young man named Miller, with a perpetually nervous disposition, froze with his hand, halfway to a stack of banknotes. A woman clutching her young son near the back wall let out a choked gasp, quickly stifling it with her hand. Panic, cold and familiar, coiled in John's gut. It was a feeling he had spent 5 years trying to outrun, a ghost that whispered to him in the lonely quiet of his ranch. He had come to Redemption Creek for peace, for a penance served in solitude. Trouble, he knew, was a contagion, and he had promised himself he would never again stand close enough to be infected. He began a slow, deliberate retreat toward the side wall, his movements economical, designed to draw no attention. He was just another rancher, another face in the crowd, a man with nothing worth taking. The leader of the trio stepped forward, his boots scuffing a rhythm of authority on the wooden floorboards. He was taller than the others, with a stillness about him that was more menacing than any overt threat. While his men moved to empty Miller's cash drawer and relieve the 2 other customers of their watches, and the leader's eyes scanned the room. They were pale, cold eyes, the color of a winter sky, and they seemed to miss nothing. They passed over. John dismissed him, and then, with a flicker of chilling recognition, snapped back. "Well, now," the leader said, his voice a low, cultured drawl that was entirely out of place with the crude violence of the moment. "What have we here?" He walked directly toward John, ignoring the growing pile of cash his men were stuffing into saddlebags. John's body tensed. Every instinct, every lesson from a life he'd tried to bury, screamed at him. He cataloged the man's movements, the balance in his stance, the way his finger rested just outside the trigger guard of his pistol, the slight tilt of his head that suggested he was listening, analyzing, predicting. This was no common road agent. This was something else. "I don't want any trouble," John said, his voice rough from disuse. The leader stopped a foot away, close enough for John to smell the faint, incongruous scent of bay rum. The man's gaze wasn't on the pouch of money in John's hand. It was fixed on the chain that peeked out from the collar of John's sweat-stained shirt. With a motion as quick as a striking snake, he reached out and hooked a finger around the chain, pulling it free. Hanging from the end was a small silver locket, tarnished with age and smoothed by the countless times John's thumb had traced its floral engravings. Inside was the only likeness he had of his wife Sarah, her smile a faint, ghostly image captured a decade ago. It was more than a memento. It was an anchor, the last piece of a life that had been shattered by his own failure. "That's a pretty little thing," the leader murmured, his voice laced with a strange, predatory curiosity. He wasn't looking at the locket. He was looking at John's face, watching the carefully constructed dam of his composure begin to crack. "It's not worth anything," John said, his voice dangerously low. "Take the money. Leave that." The leader's lips curved into a smile beneath the bandana. "Oh, I think you're mistaken. I think it's worth a great deal." He didn't yank the chain. Instead, his other hand went to the clasp at the back of John's neck. With a flick of his fingers, he undid it. The locket fell into his gloved palm. The loss was a physical blow, a sudden gaping void in the center of his chest. He could feel the blood drain from his face, the world narrowing to the silver object in the stranger's hand. This wasn't a random act of theft. It was a violation, a desecration. The man knew. Somehow he knew what this locket meant. It was a message cruel and precise. "You'll find men like him in every town west of the Mississippi," the leader announced to the terrified room, his voice rising. Men hiding from their past, pretending to be simple folk. They think if they till the soil long enough, they can bury their sins beneath it. But the past has a long memory. He closed his hand around the locket, and the metal creaking in his grip. He turned his cold eyes back to John. "Doesn't it, Marshall?" The word struck John with the force of a bullet. Marshall. No one had called him that in 5 years. No one in this valley even knew he'd ever worn a badge. He had burned the uniform, buried the medals, and erased John Marshall, U.S. Marshal, from existence. "Let's go," the leader said to his men, his business with John apparently concluded. He slipped the locket into his waistcoat pocket as if it were his own. As he walked toward the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Redemption Creek," he said, a note of dark amusement in his voice. "A fitting name. Some men come here seeking it. Others come to deliver a reckoning." The gang backed out of the bank, their rifles still trained on the frozen occupants, and melted back into the blinding sunlight. For a long moment, the only sound was the young woman sobbing quietly in the corner. Then Miller, the teller, finally let out the breath he'd been holding in a ragged shudder. John didn't move. He stood in the center of the bank, his hand instinctively reaching for his neck, his fingers finding only empty air, and the raw, burning shame of his own inaction. The money in his pouch felt like lead weight, a worthless consolation prize. The leader, the man who knew his name, hadn't just robbed him of a piece of silver. He had stolen the ghost of his wife, the last fragile remnant of his peace, and in its place he had left a declaration of war. The quiet life John had bled for was over. The past he had tried to bury had just broken ground and was clawing its way back into the light. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the parched landscape and bleaching the very life from it. The trail to John's ranch was little more than a suggestion, a faint scar winding through cracked red earth, and the skeletal remains of scrub brush. This was a land that held no affection for the living, a place where survival was a daily grinding negotiation with heat, thirst, and loneliness. For 5 years, John had found a harsh kind of solace in it. The unforgiving nature of the land mirrored the judgment he passed on himself every waking moment. He deserved no comfort, no ease, no gentle green pastures. He deserved this, a constant physical struggle that left him too exhausted at the end of the day for anything but the dreamless sleep of the damned. His ranch was a testament to this self-imposed exile. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by his own hands from timber he'd hauled down from the distant mesas. The corrals were straight and strong, the barn patched and weathered, but functional. It was a place of utility, not comfort. There were no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, no paint on the walls. The only decoration was a thick layer of dust that coated every surface, a fine red powder that seemed to seep in through the very walls, a constant reminder of the land he was trying to tame. After the robbery, the silence of the cabin felt different. It was no longer a peaceful absence of noise, but a ringing, accusing void where the faint jingle of a silver locket used to be. He moved through the familiar motions of his evening chores, with a mechanical stiffness, his mind 1,000 miles away. He drew water from the well, its cool depths a stark contrast to the fire in his belly. He fed the 2 horses that were his only companions, their soft, nickering a language of simple needs he could still understand. He chopped wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, a poor substitute for the violence he longed to unleash. As twilight bled across the sky, in bruised shades of purple and orange, he finally allowed himself to stop. He sat on the porch step, a tin cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands, and stared out at the vast, empty expanse. The image of the locket resting in the robber's gloved hand was seared into his mind. He saw Sarah's face as if the locket were open before him, her eyes full of a light that he had extinguished. The memory he had fought so hard to suppress rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as the day it happened. St. Louis, a crowded market street. He was closing in on the notorious Whelan brothers bank robbers with a reputation for shooting first and never asking questions. He'd had them cornered in an alleyway. His deputy was covering the back. It should have been simple. But John had been ambitious, eager to make a name for himself, to earn the promotion he felt he was owed. He didn't wait for backup. He went in alone. The shootout was a maelstrom of noise and smoke. He moved with the deadly grace he was known for, his Colt seeming like an extension of his own will. He shot both brothers, saw them fall. It was over in seconds. But as the smoke cleared, he saw him. A man, a civilian, a simple bookseller on his way home, caught in the crossfire. He was lying on the cobblestones, a look of profound surprise on his face, a dark stain spreading across the front of his clean white shirt. John's bullet. There was no question. It had passed clean through the younger Whelan brother and found a home in an innocent man's heart. The inquiry had cleared him, of course. A tragic accident. In the line of duty. A hero's burden. The words were hollow, meaningless platitudes that did nothing to wash the man's blood from his hands. He could still see the face of the man's wife at the funeral, her silent, consuming grief, a far more potent condemnation than any judge could deliver. He had resigned the next day, turning his back on the medals, the commendations, the promising career. He had taken Sarah's locket, the last gift she gave him before a fever took her a year prior, and he had ridden west, searching for a place so empty it could swallow his guilt whole. He had found it here in this valley that was now called Redemption Creek. He'd built a new life, the life of a ghost. He spoke to no one unless necessary, kept to himself, and worked until his muscles screamed and his mind went blessedly blank. He had almost convinced himself that John Marshall, the man who killed an innocent, was well and truly buried, until today. Doesn't it, Marshall, the robber's words echoed in the deepening twilight? Silas Kane. That's what the shaken teller had called him. The name meant nothing to John, but the man's knowledge of his past meant everything. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a summons. The calm, calculated theft of the locket was an opening move in a game John didn't understand, played by rules he didn't know. He finished his coffee and stood up, the stiffness in his joints, a reminder of his age and the brutal labor of his life. He walked back into the cabin and went to the large wooden chest that sat at the foot of his bed. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath a layer of moth-eaten blankets, was the life he'd left behind. A worn leather gun belt, the holster molded to the exact shape of a Colt Peacemaker, and the gun itself wrapped in oilcloth, its metal cool and solid in his hand. He unwrapped it. The weight felt familiar, natural. He checked the action, the smooth, satisfying click of the hammer, a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. He had thought this part of him was dead. He had hoped it was. But as he stood there in the dim light of his cabin, the gun in his hand and the memory of his wife's stolen image burning in his mind, he knew that the ghost of the man he once was had just been given a reason to rise from the grave. Peace was a luxury he no longer had. Penance had been postponed. A reckoning was coming to Redemption Creek, and this time he would be the one to deliver it. 3 days passed in a haze of restless waiting. John worked his land with a frantic energy, trying to sweat out the rage and uncertainty, but the effort was futile. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold the silhouette of a man. The peace of his solitude had been shattered, replaced by the hypervigilance of a hunted animal. He slept in Fitz's hand, never far from the butt of the Colt that now lay on the small table beside his cot. He was a man balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the push that would send him falling back into the violence he had sworn to force. It came on the third night, not as a thunderous charge of horsemen, but as a whisper in the dark. A floorboard creaked in the barn. John was awake instantly, his body moving with an ingrained fluid silence. He slid from his cot, the Colt already in his hand, and crept to the cabin's single window. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, offering little light. The barn was a hulking shape of deeper black against the horizon. He watched motionless for a full 5 minutes. Nothing. No sound, no movement. It could have been a rat or the old wood settling. But the instincts that had kept him alive for 10 years as a marshal screamed that it was something more. He slipped out the back door, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. He moved along the side of the cabin using the shadows as cover, his senses stretched to their limit. The night air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass. He circled around to the rear of the barn to a small, high window he knew had a loose pane. He hoisted himself up, peered inside, and waited for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. The barn was filled with the familiar smells of hay and horse. His 2 geldings were stirring restlessly in their stalls, their ears twitching. And there, huddled in the deepest shadows of an empty stall, was a shape. Small, silent, and terrified. John lowered himself back to the ground, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. It wasn't one of Cain's men. It was a child. He holstered the Colt and walked to the main barn doors, deliberately scuffing his feet to announce his approach. He slid the heavy wooden bar and pushed the door open. "All right," he said, his voice a low growl. "Come on out." The shape in the corner flinched, but didn't move. John lit a nearby lantern, the sudden flare of yellow light chasing the shadows back. The figure was a girl no older than 12, with a wild tangle of dark hair and eyes that were far too old for her thin, dirt-streaked face. She was clutching a bundle of rags to her chest as if it were a shield. "I'm not going to hurt you," John said, keeping his distance. "You hungry?" The girl just stared at him, her gaze a mixture of defiance and stark terror. He sighed and went back to the cabin, returning a moment later with a piece of bread and a canteen of water. He set them on the ground, well away from her, and then sat down on an overturned bucket, his back against the rough wood of a stall. "Trouble finds folks easy enough out here," he said to the quiet darkness. "Don't need to go looking for it." He waited. For a long time, the girl didn't move. Then slowly, cautiously, she crept forward and snatched the bread, retreating back into her corner like a feral animal. She ate with a desperate hunger that spoke of days without a proper meal. "What's your name?" John asked after she had finished the bread and taken a long drink from the canteen. "Lily," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "What are you doing in my barn, Lily?" Her chin came up, a flicker of anger in her wide eyes. "Hiding. From who?" "The men who took our farm. The men who work for Mr. Cain." The name landed like a stone in the quiet barn. John's carefully maintained patience evaporated. "Silas Cain." She nodded, her small body trembling. "They came 2 days ago. Said my PA owed Mr. Cain money. Pa said he didn't. There was an argument." She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the dirt floor. "One of the men shot him. They said it was a dispute. Then they told Ma and me to get off our land. Said it belonged to Mr. Cain now." John felt a familiar, sickening cold spread through his chest. It was the bookseller in St. Louis all over again. A life snuffed out over something as meaningless as a debt real or imagined. An innocent man dead, a family destroyed. "Where's your mother now?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "She sent me away. Told me to run and hide. She said she'd try to reason with them." Lily's voice broke. "She said she'd come find me, but she hadn't, and they both knew she wouldn't. Silas Cain was not a man who could be reasoned with." John closed his eyes at the weight of the girl's story settling on him like a shroud. This was the trouble he had avoided, the complication he had sworn he would never allow into his life. He had come to this valley to serve a solitary penance, not to become a guardian to a lost child. His first instinct was to send her away, to point her toward the next town and wash his hands of it. He had enough ghosts of his own. He couldn't take on hers as well. But as he looked at her, small, fierce, and utterly alone, he saw something else. He saw the consequence of inaction. He saw what happened when men like Silas Cain were allowed to operate unchecked, when good people turned a blind eye and told themselves it wasn't their fight. He had turned a blind eye once before, hiding from his own guilt, and the result was a town living in fear and a man brazen enough to steal from him in broad daylight. Lily clutched her bundle of rags tighter. They said my PA owed him, she repeated, her voice shaking with a child's conviction. Pa didn't owe nobody nothing. In her stubborn defiance, John saw the reflection of his own past failures. He had failed the man in St. Louis. He had failed his own code. He could not fail this child, too. The decision settled in his soul not as a heroic impulse, but as a grim, unavoidable necessity. He was tired of running. He was tired of hiding. And he was tired of letting men like Silas Cain write the rules. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his voice gruff to hide the turmoil inside him. "In the morning, I'm riding into town. I'm going to talk to the sheriff." Lily looked at him, a flicker of hope warring with deep-seated distrust in her eyes. "Will he help us?" John thought of the cold, calculating man who had taken his locket, the man who knew his name and his past. He thought of the power it would take to operate so openly. "I don't know," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But I'm sure as hell going to find out." The town of Redemption Creek baked under the morning sun, and the dust of its main street stirred into lazy clouds by the occasional passing wagon. From a distance, it looked like any other frontier settlement, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together against the vast, indifferent landscape. But as John rode closer, leading a second horse with Lily riding cautiously behind him, he could feel the change. The town he'd visited for supplies just a week ago had a palpable tension hanging in the air. A quiet, watchful fear that clung to the walls of the saloon and the general store like a sickness. People hurried along the boardwalks, their eyes downcast, their greetings to one another, muted and brief. Men who would normally be gathered outside the smithy sharing stories and a plug of tobacco were nowhere to be seen. The town felt hollowed out, its spirit bled dry. This was Silas Cain's work. Not just the murder of a farmer or the robbery of a bank, but the slow, systematic strangulation of a community. The sheriff's office was a small, unassuming building wedged between the land office and the undertaker. A single aging deputy sat tipped back in a chair on the porch, doing a poor job of pretending to be asleep. He opened one eye as John dismounted. "Sheriff's busy. He'll see me," John said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He helped Lily down from her horse. "Stay here and stay quiet." He pushed through the office door without knocking. Sheriff Brody was a man well into his 60s, with a drooping mustache and a weary slump to his shoulders that suggested the weight of his badge had grown too heavy over the years. He was sitting behind a cluttered desk, staring at a wall of wanted posters, as if hoping one of them might offer a solution to his problems. He looked up, his eyes showing a flash of annoyance that quickly faded into resignation. "Marshal Brody," said, his voice a gravelly sigh. "Heard about the bank? Sorry for your loss." "I'm not here about the bank," John said, closing the door behind him. "I'm here to report a murder." He laid it out clean and simple. The story Lily had told him. A farmer named Thomas Miller shot dead on his own land by Cain's men. His wife missing, his daughter an orphan. As he spoke, he watched Brody's face. The sheriff didn't look shocked or outraged. He just looked tired, his expression settling into one of profound weariness. When John finished, Brody ran a hand over his face. "That's a serious accusation, Marshal." "It's the truth," It's a 12-year-old girl's word against Silas Kane's, Brody countered. Kane owns the note on that farm. He says Miller came at his men with a pitchfork when they went to foreclose. Says it was self-defense. And you believe him? John asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Brody leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. What I believe doesn't much matter. Silas Kane is a powerful man. He's buying up land, bringing in money, talking about running a railroad spur through the valley. People see him as progress. They see him as the future. I'm just an old man trying to keep the peace until my term is up. This isn't peace. Brody John shot back, his anger finally breaking through his control. It's surrender. Call it what you want, the sheriff said, his gaze unwavering. But I'm giving you some friendly advice. You're a quiet man, Marshal. You keep to yourself. That's a good way to be in this valley right now. Go back to your ranch. Forget about that girl. Kane has already forgotten about you. Don't give him a reason to remember. The dismissal was absolute. The law, the one thing John had once dedicated his life to, was not just blind in Redemption Creek. It was bought and paid for. He stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then he turned and walked out, the feeling of utter helplessness, a bitter taste in his mouth. He stepped out onto the boardwalk and the harsh sunlight making him squint. Lily was waiting by the horses, her small face a mask of anxious hope. Before he could say a word, two men stepped out from the alley beside the sheriff's office, blocking his path. They were big men built for intimidation, with the dull, brutish look of hired muscle. John recognized them from the bank. "Mr. Kane wants a word with you," the first one said, his lips curling into a sneer. "I've got nothing to say to him." John replied gently, pushing Lily behind him. "Wasn't a request." The second man grunted, cracking his knuckles. "He just wants to remind you that some things are best left alone. Like other people's property and other people's business." John's eyes flickered past them down the street. People were stopping, watching from a safe distance, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. No one was going to intervene. Sheriff Brody's door remained firmly closed. He was on his own. "Get the girl out of here," the first man said. "This is between us and the marshal." The word hung in the air again, a challenge and an insult. These men weren't lawmen. They were thugs, hiding behind a powerful man's money. The rage that had been simmering in John since the robbery finally boiled over. He had tried to do this the right way. He had tried to appeal to the law. But the law was broken. He didn't say another word. His movement was a blur of contained violence. He shoved Lily toward the horses. "Run," he commanded. Then he turned to face the two thugs. The skills he hadn't used in 5 years came back as if they had never left a brutal muscle memory. But his body was not the same. He was slower, his reactions dulled by years of farm labor, not gunfighting. The first thug threw a wild punch, and John ducked under it, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. The man let out a grunt of pained surprise. The second man was smarter. He didn't charge. He pulled a heavy knife from his boot. John saw the glint of steel and knew this was no longer a simple brawl. He sidestepped as the man lunged, grabbing the man's wrist and using his momentum to twist the arm back at an unnatural angle. There was a sickening crack, and the man screamed, the knife clattering to the dusty street. The first thug had recovered, though, and he slammed into John from behind, wrapping his thick arms around John's chest in a bear hug. John gasped for air, his ribs protesting under the immense pressure. For a second, he thought he was finished. But then he saw Lily, her face pale with terror, frozen by the horses. The sight of her fear ignited something primal in him. With a surge of adrenaline, he stomped down hard on the thug's instep. The man roared in pain, his grip loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. John slammed his head backward, connecting solidly with the man's nose. There was a wet crunch, and the man staggered back, blood pouring down his face. John spun around and delivered a hard, precise right cross to the man's jaw. The thug's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed in a heap in the dust. John stood there, chest heaving, his knuckles bloody and raw. The street was silent, the onlookers staring in stunned disbelief. He had won, but it was a hard, ugly victory. His body ached, and a deep cut on his cheek was already starting to swell. He looked at the two men groaning on the ground, then up at the sheriff's office window, where he could just make out the shape of Brody watching him. He had just declared war on Silas Kane in the middle of Main Street. There was no going back now. He was no longer a ghost, no longer an anonymous rancher. He was John Marshall again, a man who had just shown Redemption Creek that he knew how to fight. And in doing so, he had marked not only himself, but the child he had sworn to protect as enemies of the most powerful man in the valley. The fight in the street had changed everything. John was no longer invisible. When he rode out of town with Lily, he could feel the eyes on his back, a mix of fear, pity, and a faint, dangerous flicker of respect. He had drawn a line in the dust of Redemption Creek, and now he had to find out just how far Silas Kane's territory extended. Leaving the valley was the logical choice, the safe choice. He could take Lily head for California and disappear again. But the thought was a bitter one. Running had been his solution for 5 years, and it had solved nothing. It had only delayed the inevitable. Kane had found him once. He would find him again. And more than that, the cold, calculated cruelty of the man's actions demanded an answer. This wasn't just about a stolen locket anymore. It was about the Millers and about every other family Kane had broken to feed his ambition. He began a quiet investigation, moving through the valley like a phantom. He avoided the town, instead visiting the scattered, isolated ranches that dotted the landscape. He rode under the cover of dusk and pre-dawn light, a ghost on a pale horse, seeking out whispers and rumors. At first, the ranchers were wary. They were scared men, their faces etched with the worry of dwindling water supplies and impossible debts. They had seen what happened to Thomas Miller. His first break came from a man named Elias Thorne, an old rancher whose land bordered the Miller farm. John found him reinforcing his fences, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "I saw the smoke from their chimney go out 2 days ago," Thorne said, not looking at John. "Heard the gunshot the day before that. Figured it was just a matter of time." "Did Miller owe Kane money?" John asked. Thorne spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Everyone owes Kane money. He bought the bank last year, started calling in notes, raising interest. He bought up the rights to the stream that feeds this whole side of the valley. Charges us for every bucket we draw." Tom Miller was the first to speak out against it at a town meeting. A week later, he's dead. The old man finally looked at John, his eyes full of a tired, defeated wisdom. "You made a mistake, Marshall. Fighting those boys in the street. You showed him you're not broken. Kane don't like things he can't break." John moved on his questions, growing more specific. He sought out the town's blacksmith, a burly German immigrant named Schmidt, catching him as he was closing his forge for the night. Schmidt was a man whose powerful arms could bend steel, but his voice was a nervous whisper. "He comes to me, this Mr. Kane," Schmidt said, wiping his sweaty brow with a soot-stained cloth. "He wants me to make things. Not horseshoes, not plowshares. Iron bars for windows, reinforced doors, strange brands for his cattle with a design I've never seen." He hesitated, glancing nervously toward the street. "He pays in gold, but his men, they watch. Always they watch. They make it clear this is not a job I can refuse." The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but it was the visit to the town doctor that sharpened the focus. Doc Abernathy was a man of science, precise and observant, but he had the weary soul of a priest who had heard too many deathbed confessions. John found him in his small surgery, sterilizing instruments by lamplight. I signed the death certificate for Thomas Miller, Abernathy said without preamble, his back to John. The sheriff brought me the body. The report says death by misadventure resulting from a dispute. A single gunshot wound to the chest. He paused, his hands stilling their work. It was a clean shot. From a distance. Not the kind of wound you get from a close-quarter struggle with a man holding a pitchfork. He finally turned his eyes, locking with John's. I've treated 4 other men in the last 6 months for injuries sustained in disputes with Kane's employees. Broken arms, cracked ribs, all of them ranchers who refused to sell their land. All of them signed over their deeds within a week of their accidents. John felt a cold certainty settling in. Silas Kane wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a predator, systematically dismantling the valley piece by piece, isolating his prey before moving in for the kill. But the motive still felt too impersonal. The scale of his operation seemed too grand for simple greed. And there was the lingering, unanswered question, how did he know about John's past? There's something else, Doc, Abernathy said, lowering his voice. The day of the bank robbery, Kane came to see me afterwards, said he had a touch of dust fever. A lie, of course. He was perfectly healthy. He just wanted to talk. About what? About you, the doctor replied. He didn't use your name. He just described you. The quiet rancher out by the dry wash. Asked what I knew about you. How long you'd been here. If you ever spoke of where you came from. Abernathy leaned forward, his expression grim. It was strange, Marshal. It felt like he already knew the answers. It felt like he was confirming something. And he was wearing a new affectation. A silver locket on a chain hanging from his waistcoat. John's blood ran cold. An identical locket. It couldn't be. He opened it. The doctor continued, his voice, barely a whisper. He didn't know I saw. He thought I was busy with my ledger. There was a portrait inside. A woman. Faded, but he looked at it with, I don't know what to call it. Not affection. Something closer to reverence. Or obsession. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, but it was a shape John couldn't comprehend. Kane wasn't just taunting him. He was mirroring him. The whispers he'd heard, the investigation he'd conducted, it all pointed to a single terrifying conclusion. This campaign of terror in Redemption Creek, the land grabs, the intimidation, the murders. It was all connected to him. The valley wasn't the prize. It was the arena. And Silas Kane had spent months, perhaps years, building it for a single purpose. The suspense was no longer a question of what Kane would do next, but why he was doing it at all. The answer, John suspected, was not in the valley, but in the past. And he had a frightening idea of where to find it. The office of the Silas Kane Land and Development Company was the newest and most imposing building in Redemption Creek. It stood on the corner of Main Street, a 2-story brick structure that seemed to sneer at the weathered wooden storefronts around it. It was a monument to power, a clear statement that the old ways of the valley were over. John watched it from the shadows of an alley across the street, Lily huddled beside him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the night's chill. For 2 nights they had observed the building's routine. Kane kept late hours, often staying until well after midnight. A single guard patrolled the ground floor. This is a mistake, Lily whispered, her voice trembling. If they catch you, they won't. John said, his voice more confident than he felt. He had to know. The suspicion that had taken root in his mind was too monstrous to ignore. He had to see the proof for himself. Stay here, in the alley. If I'm not back by the time the moon is straight overhead, you take your horse and you ride east. Don't stop until you reach the next territory. Understand? She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. He squeezed her shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort, and then melted into the darkness. Getting into the building was easier than he expected. Cain's arrogance was his weakness. He had invested in a strong front door and iron bars on the front windows, but the rear of the building was less secure. A second-story window left carelessly unlatched provided John with an entry point. He moved through the darkened upper floor with the silence of a predator, his senses sharp, every creak of a floorboard, a potential alarm. Cain's office was on the ground floor at the back of the building. John descended the main staircase, one slow, deliberate step at a time, his Colt in his hand. The lone guard was in the front room, his chair tipped back, a cheap novel resting on his chest. He was snoring softly. John slipped past him and into the office, closing the door behind him, with a barely audible click. The room was a reflection of its owner, meticulously organized, opulent, and cold. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface clear, except for a single, leather-bound ledger. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but they held legal texts and survey maps, not literature. A large map of the valley hung on one wall, marked with dozens of small red pins, each one representing a property Cain now owned. The Miller Farm, Elias Thorne's ranch. They were all there, a testament to his methodical conquest. John went to the desk first. The ledger contained what he expected, a detailed accounting of loans, foreclosures, and land acquisitions. It was a damning record of Cain's crimes, but it wasn't what he was looking for. He needed something personal, something that would explain the man's obsession with him. He began to search the room, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, checking drawers, lifting books, tapping walls for the hollow sound of a hidden compartment. He found it behind a framed portrait of President Grant, a small, cleverly concealed wall safe. It was a simple lock, the kind designed to deter a casual thief, not a man with his skills. Using the tip of his Bowie knife and a thin metal ruler he'd taken from the desk, he worked at the tumblers. It took him nearly 10 minutes, each metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. Finally, he heard the soft thud of the bolt releasing. He swung the small metal door open. Inside were neat stacks of currency and several velvet pouches that likely held gold. But beneath them was a small locked metal box. He carried it to the desk, the moonlight from the window providing just enough illumination. He pried the lock open with his knife. The contents were not what he expected. There were no more ledgers, no hidden deeds. There was only a stack of yellowed letters tied with a black ribbon and a single faded daguerreotype photograph. He picked up the photograph. His breath caught in his throat. It showed two men standing side by side, their arms slung around each other's shoulders in a gesture of easy camaraderie. They were both young, dressed in city clothes, their faces full of the unwritten promise of their futures. One of the men was a younger, smoother version of Silas Cain. The other was the bookseller from St. Louis. The innocent man John had killed. His hand shaking, John picked up the letters. He untied the ribbon and unfolded the top one. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded, but still legible. It was from the bookseller. His name was Thomas. Thomas Cain, asterisk, my dearest brother. Silas, asterisk, the letter began. Asterisk, St. Louis continues to prosper and the bookshop along with it. I find myself content in a way I never thought possible. My life is a simple one, but it is full of quiet joys. I only wish you could find such peace. Your letters speak of ambition and ventures in the West, and while I admire your drive, I worry it leaves no room for happiness. There is more to life than building an empire, brother. There is love and family, and the simple pleasure of a day's honest work. John sank into the chair behind the desk, the letter trembling in his grasp. He read another, and then another. They painted a portrait of two brothers, one content with a simple life, the other driven by a relentless ambition. Silas was the man's brother. The final item in the box was not a letter, but a legal document. a copy of the official inquiry into the shooting. It named John Marshall as the U.S. Marshal responsible for Thomas Kane's accidental death. The truth crashed down on John with the force of a physical blow, a weight so immense it threatened to crush the very air from his lungs. Silas Kane's entire operation in Redemption Creek, the bank, the land, the intimidation, the murders, it was all for him. It was a stage, a meticulously constructed theater of cruelty designed for a single purpose. Silas wasn't building an empire of land and money. He was building an empire of revenge. He was systematically destroying the lives of innocent people to show John what it felt like to make him watch as a community was torn apart by the actions of one man. He wanted to destroy John's life, not by killing him, but by taking away everything around him, piece by piece, just as John had taken his brother. The stolen locket wasn't the beginning of the war. It was the declaration that the trap, long and carefully laid, had finally been sprung. John looked at the map on the wall, at the red pins spreading across the valley like a bloodstain. He had come here seeking redemption from one man's death, only to find himself responsible for the suffering of dozens more. The ghost of Thomas Kane had followed him west, and it had brought its avenging brother along with it. The revelation in Silas Kane's office had stripped away the last of John's illusions. He was no longer a bystander caught in a conflict. He was the conflict itself, the very reason for the valley's suffering. The knowledge was a poison, seeping into his bones, turning his grief into a cold, hard rage. When he slipped back out of the office and rejoined Lily in the alley, she saw the change in his face immediately. The haunted weariness was gone, replaced by the grim, unyielding certainty of a man with nothing left to lose. "What is it?" she whispered. "What did you find?" The reason, he said, his voice flat and hard. "Now we ride." They didn't go back to the ranch. There was no safety there now, no refuge. Kane knew he had been discovered. The broken safe would be a clear message. John was no longer just a nuisance to be intimidated. He was a direct threat who understood the personal nature of the war. They rode hard through the night, pushing their horses east into the labyrinthine network of canyons and mesas known as the Badlands. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape, but it was a place John understood. It was a place where a man could disappear if he knew how. The sun was rising when Kane made his move. From a high ridge, John saw them, a posse of at least a dozen riders fanning out from Redemption Creek, led by a man on a fine black stallion. Even from a distance, John recognized the authoritative figure of Sheriff Brody. The law had officially chosen its side. He's turned the whole town against you. Lily said, her voice small with fear. He owns the town, John corrected her grimly, and everyone in it. He looked at the posse, then at the treacherous terrain around them. They have the numbers, but we have the land on our side. The next few days were a blur of flight and survival. John pushed them relentlessly, using every trick he had learned in his years tracking fugitives. He led them through dry riverbeds to hide their tracks, doubled back on their own trail, and moved only at night. He was transformed, the quiet rancher stripped away, to reveal the marshal beneath. He taught Lily how to read the signs of the land, how to find water where none seemed to exist, how to build a fire that produced heat but no smoke. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits and which plants were safe to eat. Lily, in turn, proved to be more resilient than he could have imagined. The traumatized girl he had found in his barn was being forged into something stronger in the harsh crucible of the Badlands. She learned quickly, her fear giving way to a quiet, stubborn determination. She rarely complained, and her watchful presence was a constant grounding force for John. In the quiet moments around their small, hidden campfires, she would ask him about his past, about the wife in the locket. At first he resisted the words catching in his throat. But her simple, honest questions slowly chipped away at the walls he had built around his heart. He found himself talking about Sarah, about their life before the fever, before St. Louis. He spoke of her kindness, her laughter, the way she had believed in the good in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. In teaching Lily how to survive, he was inadvertently reminding himself of what it meant to live for someone other than his own guilt. Her resilience became a mirror for the strength he had forgotten he possessed. She was no longer just a responsibility he had taken on. She was his purpose, the living embodiment of the innocence he was fighting to protect. But Cain was relentless. His posse was well supplied and expertly led. Twice they nearly cornered them, and John and Lily escaped only through a combination of desperate luck and John's intimate knowledge of the terrain. On the fourth day, the pursuit intensified. John realized Cain wasn't just trying to catch him, he was hurting him. The posse was systematically cutting off every route of escape, pushing them deeper into a narrow box canyon from which there was only one way out. The warrant John knew would be for the break-in. Burglary. A simple charge that would give Brody the legal cover he needed. Silas Cain was not a man who left things to chance. He was orchestrating John's downfall with the precision of a master composer, and this was the final movement of his symphony of revenge. He didn't want John dead in the Badlands. He wanted him captured, humiliated, and brought back to Redemption Creek to face a mockery of justice in the very town Cain now controlled. He wanted to break John in front of the world. As they rode deeper into the canyon, the rock walls rising like prison ramparts on either side, John knew a decision had to be made. They could not outrun the posse forever. Their food was low, their horses exhausted. He reined in his horse and turned to Lily. "This is as far as we go together." He said, his voice quiet but firm. He pointed to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, barely visible from the main trail. "There are handholds there. You can climb to the top of the mesa. From there, head due east. It will be a hard walk, but in 2 days, you'll reach the town of Prosperity. Find the marshal there. His name is Eli Vance. Tell him John Marshall sent you. Tell him everything." Tears welled in her eyes. "No, I'm not leaving you." "This isn't a choice," he said, his voice hardening. "Cain wants me, not you. As long as you're with me, you're in danger. This is the only way." He dismounted and helped her down. He pressed the last of their dried beef and a full canteen into her hands. For a moment he hesitated, then he reached into his own past, into the memory of a father he barely knew, and found a strength he didn't know he had. He knelt down so he was at her eye level. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Lily Miller," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You survived. Now you need to live. Go." She threw her arms around his neck, her small body shaking with sobs. "Promise me you'll come find me." He looked into her tear-streaked face, the face of a daughter he never had, and made a promise he had no idea if he could keep. "I promise." He watched her climb her small form, scrambling up the rock face with a sureness that made him proud. When she reached the top, she looked down one last time, then disappeared from view. John was alone again, but it was a different kind of loneliness. It was no longer the empty solitude of penance, but the sharp, aching loneliness of sacrifice. He turned his horse and rode slowly back toward the mouth of the canyon, the colt heavy on his hip. He could hear the posse getting closer now, the sound of their horses echoing off the canyon walls. He wasn't running anymore. He was going to meet them. But it wouldn't be on their terms. It would be on his. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The first sign of the storm was a stillness in the air, a heavy, oppressive calm that silenced the insects and birds. The sky to the west turned a sickly yellow-brown, the color of old bruises. John tasted grit on his teeth. A sandstorm, and a bad one by the look of it. It was the cover he needed. He had spent the hours after Lily's departure preparing the canyon floor, turning the terrain itself into a weapon. He was one man against a dozen, but he had the advantage of surprise and a burning, righteous fury. He wouldn't let them take him alive and drag him back for Cain's spectacle. If his story was to end here, it would end in a blaze of defiance. But as he waited hidden amongst a jumble of boulders, a new piece of information reached him. A lone rider, a young boy from a neighboring ranch, had tracked him down, sent by Doc Abernathy. The boy delivered the message in a panicked rush, his eyes wide with fear. Kane had grown tired of the chase. He had returned to Redemption Creek and taken hostages. Doc Abernathy and the blacksmith Schmidt. He was holding them in the saloon, along with a half-dozen other townspeople who had shown flickers of resistance. The message was clear: if John Marshall didn't surrender himself in the center of town, by sundown the executions would begin. And then Kane was going to burn the town to the ground. The news hit John like a physical blow. Kane had changed the rules of the game again. It was no longer a personal vendetta to be settled in the Badlands. He had made the entire town a pawn in his cruel endgame. John looked at the approaching storm, then back in the direction of Redemption Creek. His own life, his own fight for survival, no longer mattered. He could not let innocent people die for his past sins. He could not run forever. The reckoning Silas Kane had spoken of was here, and it was time to face it. He rode back into Redemption Creek as the storm hit. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the buildings and scouring the street with a blinding curtain of sand and dust. The world was reduced to a disorienting, dusty twilight visibility, dropping to mere feet. The town was deserted, the townsfolk huddled in their homes, the streets belonging only to the ghosts and the wind. The saloon stood as the epicenter of the storm's fury and Kane's madness. Light spilled from its windows, painting hazy yellow rectangles in the swirling dust. John dismounted a block away, tethering his horse in the lee of the livery stable. He moved through the storm like a wraith, the wind masking the sound of his approach. He crept up to a side window, the glass rattling in its frame, and peered inside. The scene was a tableau of quiet terror. Silas Kane stood behind the bar, calm and composed amidst the chaos he had created. He was impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the dust-caked hostages huddled together in a corner. Doc Abernathy Schmidt, the blacksmith, Elias Thorne, and a few others sat on the floor, their faces pale with fear. 4 of Kane's thugs stood guard, rifles held at the ready. Sheriff Brody was there too, standing near the door, his face a mask of conflicted misery. He was a man trapped as authority, a sham his badge, a symbol of his own cowardice. John felt a surge of cold, clarifying purpose. His moral dilemma, the torturous question of whether to seek justice or surrender to his own desire for revenge, evaporated in the face of this absolute evil. His purpose was simple: save those people. Stop Kane, whatever the cost. He circled to the back of the saloon. The back door was barred from the inside. He found what he was looking for in the alley, a discarded crate. He placed it under a small high window that led to the storeroom. He drew his Colt, checked it one last time, and smashed the window with the butt of the gun. The sound was swallowed by the roaring wind. He climbed through, dropping silently into the storeroom amidst sacks of flour and barrels of whiskey. He could hear Kane's voice from the main room, a smooth, articulate monologue of poison. You see, Kane was saying to his captives, this is what happens when men of principle fail to act. Your friend Marshall is a man haunted by a single mistake. He believes his inaction, his quiet suffering, is a form of penance. He is wrong. It is merely an abdication of responsibility. And now you are paying the price for it. John eased the storeroom door open a crack. He had a clear line of sight to the thug nearest the corner where the hostages were kept. The air in the saloon was thick with the smell of stale beer fear and the dust that filtered through every crack in the walls. A large grandfather clock against the far wall ticked with an unbearable rhythmic slowness, each tick a countdown to murder. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and kicked the door open. Kane, he roared, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. For a split second, everyone froze. Then the saloon erupted into chaos. John fired his first shot, striking the thug nearest the hostages. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound. Kane's other men reacted instantly, turning and firing toward the storeroom. Splinters exploded from the doorframe as John ducked back into cover. The hostages screamed and scrambled for cover under the tables. In that moment of confusion, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Brody, his face a sudden rictus of shame and resolve, drew his own pistol. He turned not on John, but on the thug standing closest to him. "No more!" Brody growled and fired. The thug staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of shocked betrayal on his face, before he fell. It was a moment of redemption, but it was short-lived. A third gunman spun and fired at Brody. The old sheriff cried out and collapsed, his leg buckling beneath him. Now it was 2 against 1. John knew he couldn't stay in the storeroom. He burst back out into the main room, firing as he moved, using the overturned tables as cover. The remaining guard fired back the shots, deafening in the enclosed space. A bullet tore through John's left sleeve, a hot sting of pain lancing up his arm. But John's focus was absolute. He saw his shot a clear line between 2 whiskey barrels. He fired. The guard went down. And then there was silence, broken only by the howling wind, the ticking clock, and the pained groans of the wounded sheriff. It was just John and Silas Kane. Kane hadn't moved from behind the bar. He held a pistol in his hand, but he hadn't fired a single shot. He was smiling, a look of serene, triumphant madness in his eyes. This was what he wanted. The final confrontation. The personal duel. "Well done, Marshal Kane," said his voice calm. "You've saved them. But you haven't saved yourself." He raised his pistol. John raised his. They stood 20 feet apart, 2 men locked in a battle that had started 5 years ago in a St. Louis alleyway. This was more than a gunfight. It was a judgment. The raw, desperate fight for John's soul was about to be decided by a single final act of violence. The ghost of Thomas Kane stood between them, waiting. The sandstorm raged outside, turning the world into a howling void. But inside the saloon, a pocket of absolute silence had fallen. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped. John stood, his Colt steady in his hand, his gaze locked with Silas Kane's. The hostages were safe for the moment, huddled behind overturned tables. The wounded Sheriff Brody was propped against the wall, his face pale but his eyes alert, watching the 2 men who held the fate of the town in their hands. "My brother was a good man." Silas said, his voice soft, almost conversational, yet it carried across the room with chilling clarity. He believed in things, in kindness, in the inherent decency of people. He wrote me letters about the simple joy he found in selling books to children. "I know," John said, his own voice a low rasp. "I read them." A flicker of surprise, then something akin to respect, crossed Silas's face. "Of course you did. You are a thorough man, Marshal. It's why you were so good at your job. So good at hunting men. So good at killing them." "It was a mistake," John said, the words feeling hollow, even to him. "An accident." "Do you think that word offers any comfort?" Silas countered, taking a small step out from behind the bar. "An accident that left his wife a widow and his brother with a hole in his life that could never be filled? I came to the funeral. I watched you. You stood in the back, your face a mask of regret. I knew then that killing you would be too easy. It would be a mercy. I wanted you to feel what I felt, the slow, grinding erosion of everything you hold dear. I wanted you to watch your world burn." As he spoke, John saw a flicker of movement near the saloon's swinging doors. He didn't dare take his eyes off Silas, but his heart clenched. Lily. She had followed him. She was peeking through the gap in the doors, her small face a ghostly image in the swirling dust. The sight of her clarified everything. This wasn't about his guilt anymore. It wasn't about vengeance or absolution. It was about her future. "It's over, Kane," John said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "You've had your revenge. You've made your point. It's over when I say it's over." Silas snarled, his composure finally cracking, revealing the raw grief and madness beneath. He gestured with his gun toward the hostages. "Their lives are on your soul, Marshal. Just like my brother's." He fired. But he didn't fire at John. He fired at the large oil lamp hanging from a chain over the center of the room. The bullet shattered the glass, and flaming oil rained down on the dry wooden floorboards. Flames erupted instantly, spreading with terrifying speed, feeding on the spilled whiskey from the bar. Smoke and heat filled the room. The hostages began to cough and scream, scrambling toward the back door. In the chaos, John moved. He didn't fire at Silas. He fired at the chain holding the heavy ornate chandelier above the bar. The chain snapped. The massive fixture of iron and glass crashed down not on Silas, but directly in front of him, creating a wall of twisted metal and fire that blocked him from the rest of the room. John ran to the hostages. "Out, go," he yelled. And shoving them toward the exit, Doc Abernathy was struggling to unbar. He helped a dazed Elias Thorne to his feet and pushed him toward safety. Then he went back for Brody. "Go on, Marshal," the old sheriff wheezed, clutching his bleeding leg. "Leave me. No one else dies today." John grunted, hauling the surprisingly heavy man onto his shoulder. He carried him through the thickening smoke, his lungs burning, his eyes streaming. As he reached the back door, he saw Lily run in. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the bar at the fire. And on the floor where Silas had dropped it when the chandelier fell was the silver locket. She darted forward, snatched it from the floor just as the flames licked at the wood, and then scrambled back out into the storm. John carried Brody out into the alley and laid him gently on the ground. The storm was already beginning to subside, the wind's howl lessening to a mournful sigh. From the front of the saloon, he could hear Silas Kane screaming a sound of pure, impotent rage as the fire consumed his stage and his vengeance. Then another sound cut through the wind. Hoofbeats, a lot of them. A group of riders emerged from the dust-shrouded street, their forms solidifying into the unmistakable shapes of federal marshals. They swarmed the saloon, weapons drawn, taking control of the scene with practiced efficiency. One of them, a man with a grim face and captain's bars on his collar, strode over to John. "Marshal Vance from Prosperity got a message from a very determined young lady," the man said, looking from John to the burning building. "Said you might need a hand." John looked over at Lily, who was standing safely with Doc Abernathy and the other rescued hostages. She met his gaze, her small hand clutching the precious silver locket. The fire department's volunteer brigade arrived, their pump wagon struggling through the dusty streets. The townspeople, drawn by the flames and the arrival of the law, began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning hope. The sandstorm died as quickly as it had arrived. The morning sun broke through the clouds, its golden light illuminating a town that was battered, scarred, but not broken. The saloon was a smoking ruin, but the rest of the town was intact. Silas Kane was led out, his fine clothes singed, his face blackened with soot, his eyes empty. He was defeated, a man whose grand opera of revenge had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of handcuffs. John had won. He had chosen justice over vengeance. And as he watched them lead Kane away, he felt not triumph, but a profound and weary sense of peace. The federal marshal, whose name was Captain Hayes, approached John as the last of the embers in the saloon were being doused. Hayes was a man cut from the same cloth as John had once been, all hard lines and quiet authority. He looked at John's torn sleeve and the raw, bruised knuckles of his hands. "I remember reading the file on your resignation," Hayes said, his voice devoid of judgment. "The St. Louis incident. A lot of us thought the board was wrong to even hold an inquiry." "You were a good lawman, Marshal." John just nodded, too tired for words. His arm throbbed, and every muscle in his body ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "The territory could use a man like you." Hayes continued, his meaning clear. There's an open position for a deputy commander based out of Prescott. The badge is yours if you want it. 5 years ago, the offer would have been the culmination of all his ambitions. It was the life he had once craved, a life of purpose and respect defined by the law he served. He looked over at the townspeople who were beginning the slow, difficult work of putting their lives back together. Schmidt was helping the doctor tend to Sheriff Brody's leg. Elias Thorne was organizing a group to check on the outlying ranches. They were not waiting for a lawman to save them. They were saving themselves. "Thank you, Captain John," said his voice steady. "But my time as a lawman is over. My path is a different one now." Hayes nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Well, if you ever change your mind, you know where to find us." Later that day, after he had given his official statement and had the doctor stitch the cut on his arm, John found Lily sitting on the steps of the general store. She had cleaned the soot from the silver locket, and it gleamed in the afternoon sun. She held it out to him. "This is yours," she said simply. He took it from her, the metal cool and familiar in his palm. He opened it and looked at Sarah's faded, smiling face. For 5 years, this locket had been a symbol of his grief, a constant physical reminder of his loss and his failure. It had shackled him to the past, keeping the wound of his guilt fresh and raw. He looked from the locket to Lily's face, so full of resilience and nascent hope. He had fought for his past, but he had won for her future. In a powerful symbolic act that felt more significant than any gunfight, he closed the locket and gently placed it in Lily's hand, closing her small fingers around it. "The past is the past," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You hold on to the future." A tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "What will you do now?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a choice." Just then, Captain Hayes approached them one last time. "Marshal," he said, holding out a sealed envelope. "Kane asked me to give this to you. Said you'd want to read it." John took the letter, a feeling of unease settling over him. He tore it open. It wasn't a letter from Silas. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, and heartbreakingly neat. It was the last letter Thomas Kane had ever written to his brother, penned the morning of the day he died. Asterisk, "Dearest Silas," asterisk, it read. Asterisk, "I must confess something to you, a matter I have kept secret for fear of your judgment. The men you warned me about, the Whelan brothers, have been using my shop to transfer their funds. I know it is wrong, but I am in their debt of foolish gambling loss from my youth that has haunted me for years. They have threatened my wife, my livelihood. I am trapped, brother. Today, I have decided to end it. I have sent a message to the U.S. Marshals. I am going to testify against them. I know the risk is great, but I cannot live as a coward any longer. By the time you read this, I pray I will be a free man in one way or another." John read the letter twice, and the words blurring through the sudden moisture in his eyes. Thomas Kane, the innocent man, had not been so innocent after all. He had been a victim, yes, but also a participant in the criminal enterprise that had led to his death. John's tragic mistake, the single act that had defined 5 years of his life and driven Silas Kane to madness, was not the clear-cut black-and-white failure he had always believed it to be. The world was a messier, more complicated place than that. The knowledge didn't excuse his actions. It didn't erase the fact that he had taken a life. But it lifted the final crushing weight of his guilt, the part of him that had believed he was solely and completely responsible for destroying a good man's life. The truth was far more gray. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. He looked up at the vast open sky, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer a haunted man, but a redeemed one, free to build a new life, not on the ashes of his past, but on the foundation of a future he had fought for and won. He squeezed Lily's shoulder one last time, turned, and walked toward his horse. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time, he felt like he was riding toward something instead of running away.